Our second topic in this module involves the practice of mortuary cannibalism, which we looked at a very brief example of in an earlier module, but today we'll look at a particular case study in South America. Mortuary cannibalism is a cultural response to death of a group member. We unfortunately know very little about how the socially constituted symbols of this practice relate to emotions and also how they fit into individuals' lived experiences of mourning. There has tended to be a focus on what's called exo-cannibalism. This is the eating of your enemies or out-group members, people not within your own community. And this has resulted in the interpretation of anthropophagy, I'm not actually sure how to say that, as an antisocial act. Few studies of endocannibalism tend to highlight its socially integrative dimensions, which the study today actually does a really good job of instead. This is primarily because a lot of our research is focused on Melanesia, where there are diverse systems that expressed a variety of cultural meaning that shares two central ideas: an assumption that cannibalism primarily benefits those who consume human substance, as well as the existence of an economy of biosocial substances in which cannibalism serves as a means of acquiring body substances, vital energies, or personal attributes contained in the corpse, or of transferring them to those who eat it. So essentially a way of kind of taking on the power of someone else is through the consumption of their flesh. And what we'll see with the WARI example today is that this is not necessarily an explanation for how and why they engage in this practice. So thanks to the work of Dr. Beth CONKLIN, we have the article that you all read in this week, which describes the WARI funeral rituals. So she's a professor at Vanderbilt University. She is a cultural and medical anthropologist. Her research interests involve anthropology of the body, death and mourning, religion and ritual, as well as the politics of indigenous rights, health, and healing. So she lived amongst these people. She learned about their traditional funerary rituals through interviews, primarily of older community members, who are those that, participated in or observed this practice. Her article also documents some history around the abandonment of this practice. There was some widespread sickness from the spread of a disease that caused the deaths of many WARI members. This led to an inability to produce enough food to support their people, so they became more dependent on outsiders for food. And because of that, outside missionaries were able to sort of leverage this prevention of mortuary cannibalism, and they eventually abandoned the practice. So where are we talking about? The WARI communities. There are about 1,500 individuals. They inhabit the Brazilian rainforests along the border with Bolivia. Among two river areas, the province is called Rondônia, but they don't actually live on or really use the rivers for more than just fishing. As I said, prior to contact in the 1950s, they lived in smaller villages of approximately 30 people who resided as nuclear family households. The role of affinity, that is, who you relate to and how, was the strongest organizing principle in WARI society. Alliances, however, were created amongst families through intermarriage. The WARI have a diverse diet that includes resources obtained by hunting, fishing, foraging, as well as corn agriculture. And they have a particularly important relationship with hunting and animals, as we'll see is involved within their mortuary practice. Traditionally, they've practiced compassionate acts of cannibalism as part of their mortuary rituals. And in this case, we're talking about endocannibalism. So that means in-group consumptions. You are eating members of your own community rather than enemies. During the ritual itself, the corpse is never left alone. Mourners, which tend to be only family and close relatives, they hug and cradle the body until its disposal. Mourners sympathize with the deceased state by fainting or lying on top of one another to cause fainting. After all of the family had visited, the body was dismembered, roasted, and consumed by family and close friends, those who are considered their affines. The wooden beams from neighboring homes were used to construct the funeral fire at a location of the deceased individual's home. And so the article talks about, the sagging roofs of structures nearby, and this is sort of a way that the community itself is also signaling that, they've lost one of their own. Think about it as like lowering the flags at half-mast when we have a major loss here in the States. CONKLIN describes how dismemberment was viewed as the most emotionally painful part of the ceremony when they actually are cutting up the deceased. Once the consumption part of the ritual begins, that's seen more as a relief and, the best way to treat the body. So it's really when it's being cut up, it's no longer a whole person as you knew them, that becomes really emotionally painful. The ritual rejects traditional views of cannibalism, as we primarily know from Melanesia, where they view human flesh as food. The deconstruction of human flesh is seen as a hostile act, often associated with exocannibalism. Again, that's eating people outside of your own community or your enemies. Instead, CONKLIN finds that it's an entirely different practice altogether. It's endocannibalistic and it's respectful. It's a difficult act in which to engage in, but it is the right act from the emic perspective of the WARI. It's also a transformation that takes place. So prior to death, dying WARI members express a desire to be eaten rather than placed in the unclean earth. They see earth burial as being very disrespectful. In fact, even the spilling of blood or other bodily substances onto the ground is something they try to prevent. Eating instead is considered a sign of respect and has deep roots in the WARI worldview, especially when it comes to human-animal relations. So the consuming of humans prevents the abandonment of that person in the ground. So you're letting them go on in a new way. You're not just leaving them behind. In this sense, meat eating for the WARI is an expression of social integration and happiness. Close relatives, the consanguines of the deceased, as in the people who share actual blood with that person, could not perform these acts during mourning. They are not the ones who were doing the actual consumption. Instead, it was extended family members and relatives and friends, their affines, that consumed the deceased to help the family forget the image of the deceased. Amongst the WARI, the human body is seen as the primary nexus of kinship, personhood, and social relations, and we can see that reflected in the sort of taboos or views they had on who can and cannot do certain things during the mortuary ritual. The body itself is the focal point during the ceremony. You'll see mourners who want to just maintain this contact from that person's death all the way until their corpse is disposed. This is part of what we're seeing with this is that there's no mind, body, spirit separation. For the WARI, the body and the corpse are considered to be an embodiment of that person's identity, their social relations, and interpersonal bonds. So the transformation of the body into a new form is essential in restructuring the relationships between the dead and the living. Thanks to the work of Dr. CONKLIN, we now have an understanding of WARI mortuary rituals. The destruction of the corpse via dismemberment, roasting, and consumption signified a transformation from human into an immortal animal. What they see this as the recently deceased becoming game animals and sending their ancestors, so wild pigs and fish, to the land of the living for their relatives to hunt and consume. So very often the funeral itself is followed by a ritual hunt that the family participates in. This allows the family of the deceased to end their period of mourning and ritually kill their recently deceased family member, thus providing meat to their society and ending the period of mourning through the consumption of animal meat. This is a very complex relationship between sustenance and death. In their worldview, human death is required for animal death, and mortuary cannibalism is an essential element of keeping their society going. This is the main way they know to forget the deceased, so removal of the reminders or possessions of the deceased is an essential way to prevent them from dwelling on thoughts of the dead. So they destroy their material possessions or give things away. The consumption of the flesh itself is an act of forgetting. And then the actual transformation of the physical body into sustenance, no longer being a human person, but just a way of fueling future generations. So what do the WARI think? What is their emic or insider's perspective on their own ritual? Well, they see it as coming down to three primary things. It's pragmatic. Someone has to dispose of the body, and the immediate or consanguinal family cannot be the people to do this because they share fluid, they share bodily substances, the blood, with the deceased. So this task then falls to their affinal family members instead. Second, these rituals are politically motivated. These mortuary rituals are important in strengthening and renewing affinal ties within the community after a death. And lastly, they're an expression of respect. So eating is a form of respect, which is a stark contrast to what we see among Western views of domination. Instead of being laid to rest in a dirty place like the ground, which would be respectful, they practice, this endocannibalism as a way of honoring their dead. This practice of mortuary cannibalism actually originates within the WARI creation myth. So CONKLIN describes that in her article. She talks about how fire was originally possessed by an old woman who ate children raw and exacted tribute of firewood and fish from the WARI, thus violating this sort of egalitarian ethos that they had. Two boys eventually steal fire from the woman, and she falls into the fire, which releases carnivores into the world. Other animals originated when the WARI jumped from the sky back to Earth. Thus, people and animals share this sort of common origin. Eventually, a man killed and stole the fire from the two boys. A shaman eventually tricked him and stole the fire for himself, but he shared it with all of the WARI, making them a hunting and farming society. So basically, in return for fire, the WARI people must roast your children. That's the sort of expected practice that they are meant to engage in as a thank you to this shaman who shared fire with them. According to CONKLIN's informants, they saw endocannibalism as a natural balance to humanity's acquisition for fire. So this brings us to our activity for this week. I'm asking you to read the article and then write a summary of WARI mortuary ritual as described by CONKLIN using the three stages involved in a rite of passage. So to remind you, rites of passage are specialized rituals that societies employ to assist members at key times of biographical change. And it involves the three stages you see listed here: separation, transition, and reincorporation. So do your best to sort of parse out how each of these stages are involved and manifested within this specific mortuary ritual, and go ahead and write that up, submit it through Canvas. While you're doing so, though, I want you to also consider the questions you see listed here and write a separate paragraph on that. What was your stance on mortuary cannibalism before and after reading CONKLIN's article? Were your thoughts transformed at all? And how does the WARI example mix with your conceptualizations of cannibalism? All right, good luck and enjoy.